Sorry, everyone. It is going live. The bar is traveling across the YouTube page, and I think it's going live now. Apologies to everyone for the wait.
Heck, do you want me to put in the landing page?
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Hi, everyone, and welcome to part one of Homework, Lived Experiences Through Architectural Histories, a symposium organised by the 2019 to 2020 cohort of the Architectural History MA at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Thank you for joining the event this evening. My name is Adam and I will be your host for the event. This symposium and the following publication aim to reflect on what is afforded and lost to us online during the coronavirus pandemic, whilst also showcasing a wide range of themes from architectural conservation, post-war housing, activism, health, and the global city, themes that are reflected by our keynote speakers over the next 2 days. While physical archives have lain dormant and inaccessible, as researchers, we have been made to reassess how we approach the study of architectural history. Our research has been forced to change, adapt, and invent alternative kinds of evidence. The range of work produced by this year's cohort has been moulded by how able we are to bring the outside world into our personal spaces and how we can reflect this in our homework, the product of which comes in the form of this symposium. Today's focus is physical histories and material sensibilities, and our speakers will be Catherine Croft, Dr. Yanina Gosai, and Dr. Anuradha Siddiqui. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to run through the practicalities of how this evening is meant to be organised. Each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes and will be introduced by a member of the cohort. Another cohort member will then be invited to respond before we introduce open question sessions. If you're in the Zoom call, please either raise your hand or put your name in the chat bar so we can see your interest in speaking. If you're attending via our YouTube channel, please put your question in the chat bar and we will make it visible to the chair or speaker to respond. If you do not manage to have your question answered, we will pass these on to the speakers at the end of the session. Please note that we are recording the event and we are also following the UCL's Code of Conduct about respect for equality, diversity and inclusion for our discussion. Please can you also ensure that you have your microphones on mute unless you are speaking, and when the screens are shared, please turn off your videos. I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Catherine Croft. Catherine is an expert on post-war architecture and the public perception of 20th century design. She's the director of the 20th Century Society, the National Amenity Society for buildings constructed since 1918, and lectures widely on heritage and the built environment issues in the UK and abroad. Her work with the Getty Conservation Institute includes a practical guide to concrete repair in historical buildings. And I will hand over now to you, Catherine.
Hi, thanks very much, Adam. Let me do the screen share thing. Yeah. Great. Okay, so yeah. So as Adam said, my day job is that I run the 20th Century Society, and we are the building preservation organisation for all buildings from 1914 onwards. This is just a screen grab from our website highlighting some of the news stories that we've been working on during lockdown. I think I initially thought that lockdown might mean that the sort of proposals to change buildings might dry up. It's absolutely not been the case. We've been as busy as ever. But it's been really weird because we since March, we've been totally out of our offices in Farringdon. We haven't seen one another. We've all been working from home, and it's been really nice to be invited along tonight to actually kind of take the time to reflect on what impact this has had on our practice. I mean, my kind of initial feeling was that I was missing all the fun bits of the job. I was missing going out and seeing buildings, meeting people, you know, that trying to persuade people of why a building's important and what's special about it is so much harder to do over Zoom or over the phone than it is if you're actually physically standing in the building with them. But on many ways, the sort of practicalities of doing what we do have gone on remarkably without really, you know, without stalling at all. We've switched very quickly to doing Zoom committee meetings. We've been doing Zoom site visits where either you know, someone walks around a building holding up an iPad and we feel vaguely sick as they lurch from room to room, or we've been given tours of buildings by people who are wanting to alter them. The latter, I think, is really interesting because if you're on a building site with someone, you know, you can always ask to go through that door or around the back, or you know, have a look from a different angle. You don't have to just see the proposed impact of the roof extension from where the CGI that they've chosen to send you is taken. You know, when you're doing a PowerPoint site visit of a building and a proposal to alter it, you really are being very tightly controlled by the person who's put it together. And that's been, I think, for me, one of the most frustrating things about trying to do casework in a virtual world. So I wanted to sort of share with you really some reflections on not just kind of my immediate work, but the kind of whole intersection of my working for 20th century and the impact on my daily life of the of lockdown. And as soon as we were able to go back on the tube, I didn't go on the tube at all from March right through till September. And I guess I was tempted back because my daughter goes to secondary school and went back and was traveling on the tube, and it seemed foolish to not do the same. And then I thought posters were really interesting. You know, enjoy some thinking time on your way, whatever. And I kind of really liked this. I like not least the fact that it is about having thinking time. It's not suggesting that you might be plugged into a podcast, or you know, there's so much kind of digital media that's been made available to us in this period that actually the feeling that having time to just think and ponder has become an incredible luxury. Even though many of us are physically on our own quite a lot of the time. So I was kind of interested in that. Last weekend, I was really struck by this. This is the Samaritan's plaque on the Hungerford Bridge. I guess the previous slide is a kind of real positive take on thinking time, you know, that suggesting that those thoughts that flood into our minds will be creative and positive and constructive. But obviously all the time at the moment, we're also being fed a you know, stream of concern about the mental health impact of COVID. And I guess I'm particularly aware one of my volunteers works for the Samaritans, and you know, so I was talking to her about how much they've had to step up during this period. And then again on the tube, I thought this was kind of interesting. This somehow really struck a chord with me, and I think what really spoke to me was this real sort of visceral, experiential idea. I mean, this is incredibly kind of almost romantic and nostalgic about the morning commute which is kind of extraordinary, really. I definitely haven't been not going on the tube long enough to feel that way about it. You know, getting an hour to yourself in the morning. But I think the things like, you know, the flicker of light, laughing out loud, being around people, all those sorts of things really, really remind me of, you know, the experiential quality of buildings, and why it is that at 20th century society we are so adamant that what we want to do is actually preserve real buildings. You know, that we are totally convinced that one, by preserving a building, you know, there's no substitute for it, however good a photographic record or a virtual reality experience. You're just going to miss the, you know, the smells and the sounds and the sort of visceral experience of being in a building, and that's partly why we do what we do. And that certainly, when I was reading through the abstracts, I felt, you know, that there was a real enjoyment of that kind of sense of buildings coming out through what some of you were writing. What are we doing? And although, I mean, I don't know whether maybe because I'm not getting to see buildings, I'm not getting to look at architectural details up close. I think I've become incredibly oversensitized maybe to the marks and patterns of both man and nature in my immediate environment. So, you know, massive paint spill gets splurged down the street, the shadowy skeletons of autumn leaves pressed onto pavements around us. And I think it was partly, I mean, I think this is sort of both ways feeding. We've been doing with our Instagram feed at 20th Century, we've been asking people to submit their favorite 20th century detail of a building. And that started off just as a kind of sort of fun thing to kind of cheer us all up and give our membership some sense of continuing participation. But it's really taken off, and we've had a lot of incredibly interesting contributions to that. And we're actually going to produce those as a book in the next couple of months. But I think I don't know, maybe I'm so starved of architecture that I'm looking for visual detail and interest practically, you know, absolutely everywhere I'm going at the moment. And then I guess I was thinking over, obviously for the last few days, I was very aware of what's happening in the States. And I think that took me back to, I read architecture as a you know, practical degree, thinking I wanted to be an architect as an undergraduate. And then I went to America to do this program, which still exists, American Material Culture. And I think I was feeling that this program, you know, which is very much, it's based in a museum, it's all about looking at objects, it's about reading what an object uniquely can tell you, and I think that probably has had a major impact on how I look at buildings. But I was also kind of drawn back to thinking about this because I mean, there are basically, I think there were probably two big issues for us at the beginning of the year that I thought I would be dealing with. One of which was the kind of Black Lives Matter agenda and how we deal with contested heritage. And thinking myself back into Winterthur, I thought this is actually a collection of decorative art objects through a period where I imagine a very, very large percentage of them are the products of wealth drawn from slavery. And I was wondering what Winterthur was doing, what I might learn from the museum world's interaction with objects in that context for how we deal with casework issues to do with not just buildings with links to slavery, but buildings increasingly with links to empire and how we can, you know, make sure that we are responding in an appropriate way to those sorts of cases. The other thing I thought I was going to be dealing with a lot is obviously the impact of climate change, and which in many ways is very positive. I mean, there are very positive ways in which building conservation can participate in that. Almost always, retaining, upgrading a building is going to be far more environmentally friendly than demolishing and starting again. A lot of the buildings, particularly the massive concrete brutalist buildings that we campaign for, have a huge amount of embodied energy in them. And often it's those arguments, as much as the arguments about the architectural and historic significance, that I think initially grab people's attention and get them to look again when a building's proposed for demolition. But I suppose at an absolutely local level, and I'm very conscious again of this idea of being thrown back on the local and back into the kind of residential neighbourhood. The whole business, I live right in a part of Southwark that's been completely closed down with traffic calming measures, huge amounts of backlash against this. And I was interested in this article in Guardian really because it was just highlighting how much that backlash is associated with fears of gentrification. And I felt that was, to me, a challenge to look again at the really quite complicated and challenging relationship between historic preservation and gentrification, particularly for us, where a lot of the buildings we are dealing with are social housing, and with cases like Balfron Tower in the East End, where preservation has partial preservation, ripping the guts out of the building, in fact, but where the I'm certain that a large part of the significance of that building was the fact that it was social housing, and although it's been kept and has a sustainable future, it's now going to be private housing. So, okay, and then just finally, into the mix of what we, where we are, we've had a government planning white paper, planning for the future. So this has been announced and consulted on during lockdown, and it really is a kind of really radical proposal to this is Boris Johnson from the Forward, basically saying that radical reform is what we need, no more fiddling around the edges, let's rip up the planning system and start again. It's really hard, I think, to engage with this when we're all in separate places. We can't come together as with other organisations other than on Zoom to discuss this. And particularly, I think, with responding to something like this, there's the kind of bigger picture stuff. Do we think this is a completely crazy, mad idea altogether? Should we be saying that actually the last thing we need to do at the moment, when we haven't actually managed to, sort out Brexit, we've got COVID to sort out, have we remotely got time to actually think about a new planning system for England from the bottom up? Why do it now? The current system might not be perfect, but it's reasonably competent, versus a much more engaged discussion about looking at the minutiae of the proposals and talking through how those can be modulated so that they don't result in a loss of preservation protection. The government's stance is that this is all, as though this is all about facilitating more housing, but that the intention is to do that without either damaging the green belt or reducing the amount of protection to historic buildings. And it just seems such a vast project to be embarking on at this time. and to be doing in a time when it's, you know, it's just really, really difficult to have the sorts of discussions and public meetings on it that one would want to be having. And this is just an image from that consultation document on the white paper. And one of the things that it says is that, you know, it's crazy that decisions to grant consent are taken on a case-by-case basis. It's a massive push to set up design standards, to set up design codes, to set up processes whereby, you know, can you have planning permission or not will pop out of a nicely, neatly drawn up matrix. Whereas I feel really strongly that it's very, very difficult to get great architecture out of that, and that a lot of the buildings I care about are the product of a much more nuanced planning system that really did rely on individual professional expertise in assessing whether a building should be given the go-ahead. So, I mean, I feel very much in limbo. I don't know how long the casework that we do will carry on, how long it will be before, you know, planning permissions grind to a halt. We constantly are getting anecdotal evidence of architects laying off large numbers of people. And, you know, in some ways, a downturn in the economy and lack of pressure for redevelopment is good for conservation, you know. But on the other hand, we have a lot of buildings that we care about that we desperately feel need new investment and new uses in order to ensure their long-term future. And we're consulting on schemes to convert, for instance, the Wood Street Police Station in the City of London into a boutique hotel. We've got schemes to convert office buildings into residential. And although we are talking about those and deciding, you know, detailing the how they would impact on the historic fabric of a building, it all feels incredibly nebulous. It feels like, yeah, I have no idea whether any of those projects will actually go ahead. And actually, at the moment, thinking what a post-COVID future would be like is really very difficult. So, meanwhile, this was the South Bank on Saturday night. You wouldn't have thought there was anything any different. So thanks very much. That's my 15 minutes, maybe slightly more, sorry.
Great, thank you, Catherine. That was really interesting hearing kind of your experience of dealing with your kind of day-to-day work in a kind of pandemic age. That's really quite interesting. I'll now pass over to Sadaf, who is going to kick off the questions. And yeah, so Sadaf, take it away.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for the amazing talk. I really enjoyed your reflection on the immediate environment in the way that we are more engaged with our surrounding environment these days. I guess my question is, how can we redefine and reflect on the notion of architectural heritage in the time of pandemic, especially when our movement in the cities and interaction with the buildings and sites are limited more than ever?
I think our opportunities are limited, and I mean, one of the things that normally I'm doing is organising loads of tours and trips for our members and supporters, and obviously all that's completely out the window at the moment. We're doing Zoom talks, but we're not getting out there and looking at buildings. But I mean, but on the other hand, I think people on the whole are exploring their local neighbourhoods a huge amount more, and you know, one of the things that the government at the moment is putting money into is local listings. So I think there is a kind of real push to get people to go out and look at the local and the particular and explore that. And I think kind of that will be interesting when I mean, I'm very conscious that I'm doing that myself, and then I'm getting I'm getting a kind of very in-depth understanding of a small area, and then how will I extrapolate from that when I get let out back into the whole of the world? What will that be? Whereas maybe for the last few years I've done a lot of the other, of going to conferences in different cities, getting a snapshot of somewhere, and then bringing that back to in some way inflect on how I deal with my work in London. Kind of, I feel I've been tipped up the other way.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think we've got a question from Paul now. So Paul, if you'd like to turn on your camera and microphone.
Right. I hope they're both turned on.
Yeah.
You talked at one stage. Thanks for an excellent talk first. I really enjoyed it. You talked at one stage about a more nuanced planning system. And one thing that always strikes me about, the difficulty with 20th century architecture is it's in a way a product of a planning system. In a way, people don't feel, or a lot of people don't feel, that it was built in a democratic spirit. And I just wondered how you relate to the idea of a planning. The previous planning system is not felt to have been, by a lot of people, to have delivered democratic objectives. I don't think the new one will either, but I'd just be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, and I mean, and a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the stuff that the minister's been saying as he's been presenting the white paper has been, slagging off the buildings of, this is an opportunity to undo all those terrible concrete monstrosities of the 60s and 70s. And we've heard that. And I had a meeting with him and specifically said, look, you might think they're monstrosities, but actually there are other points of view. I think having a democratic planning system is really, really difficult. I mean, and part of what the thrust of the white paper is moving to more online consultation, more consultation at an early stage. So getting people to comment on area-wide proposals, and setting up guidance rather than actually getting people to engage at the point when a single building is threatened. And for us, the history of the conservation movement, has been one to a large extent of, chaining yourself to the bulldozer when a particular building is threatened. And it's much, much easier to get people to engage when, a specific single building is threatened with demolition. Getting people to participate, I think, in local plans and is just incredibly difficult. I think that's part of my problem with the planning white paper, is I think it's incredibly unrealistic in terms of what level of public buy-in it will get for going on ahead.
Great.
I don't know whether I feel, I mean, yeah. How democratic was the planning process at all those across those decades? I think that's a really complicated and interesting question. And I think there's a sort of subset of that of how democratic as the sort of processes of conservation against that. Because I think we've moved from a period when there were a lot of kind of really quite well covered in the press, well talked about planning inquiries. When a planning inquiry is in and of itself a public meeting that anyone can show up at, that forum has basically become incredibly rare. And also it's become increasingly difficult for any kind of individuals or local groups to take anything to planning inquiry, because now you're very much up against massive teams of planning consultants on massive salaries acting for developers. So.
Great. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Catherine, can I just ask if you could stop sharing your screen if possible?
Oh, yes. Yeah, let's do that.
That'd be great. Thank you. So if anyone has a question at all for Catherine, either on YouTube or on here, that'd be great to have one more before we move on to the next speaker. Otherwise, I can chuck a question into the ring if needs be. Right, well, I guess I will ask you a question, Catherine, if that's okay. I'm just kind of wondering, it's interesting hearing your kind of views on how you've experienced these buildings and sites in a digital method. And I'm just kind of curious as to what extent you feel like that is a valid way or a legitimate way or of experiencing these buildings and going through those processes, or do you kind of believe that maybe kind of historic preservation and heritage is something that really does need to remain kind of off the internet and in person, or can the two kind of modes and methodologies exist kind of side by side?
I think there have been some positive things. I mean, we have a casework committee which normally meets just in London, and therefore, you know, that limits who can come. And we've been able to spread our net much wider and get much broader regional representation on that committee, which has been really good. But I think I am just, you learn so much more about a building when you go and walk around it. You can't, you know, it is so selective. However, you know, if you show me 100 images, it's nothing compared to the experience of being there, being able to be on site, you know, to be there holding the original drawings, comparing what's there now with what's, you know. And I think I'm constantly frustrated by you know, I feel I'm kind of doing everything with boxing gloves on or something.
Yeah, I can imagine it's not exactly the most ideal way. That's interesting, especially in a time when kind of everyone is being told that everything can be done digitally. So
yeah, well, and like as you were suggesting, all of you were very frustrated. We have very limited access to archives, and that's, again, that's another restriction on what we're doing.
Great. I think we're going to pass over to the next speaker, but thank you so much, Catherine, for that talk. It was really fascinating hearing your experiences. So I'm going to hand over now to Mina to introduce the next speaker. Thanks, Mina.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Our next speaker is Dr. Janina Gosai, who is Associate Professor of Urban Architecture at TU Delft. Her research is situated at the nexus of 20th century architectural and urban history on the one hand, and social and political history on the other. Her most recent book is Speaking of Buildings, Oral History in Architectural Research, which she edited together with Naomi Stad and Deborah van der Plaat. I will now hand over to you, Janina. You can start sharing your screen.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I will see, whoops. I hope you can now see the presentation. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Thanks so much. So good evening. First, I would like to thank the organizers for including me in this wonderful event, which I think has a very challenging brief. The symposium is about homework and lived experience through architectural histories. And my homework, and by this I mean the work that I do from home these days, has to do with public space. And the question that is posed in the symposium is what is afforded and lost to us during this coronavirus pandemic. And from a personal viewpoint, the pandemic has some perks. I can, for instance, prepare dinner while listening to a lecture by Reynold Martin, who's another speaker in this symposium tomorrow. But reflecting on this question from the viewpoint of my work on public space, I would say that quite a bit is also lost. As we all know, public space is where you encounter the other. And by that, I mean people who are different to you, people who look different, who act different, who have different interests, who vote differently to you, and so on. And as we retreat from our analog public spaces into cyberspace, these encounters with others become less frequent. So I would argue that in spite of all the affordances of the World Wide Web, our world becomes smaller, not larger. But perhaps I'm biased in saying this, as through my research on public spaces that were realized in the 20th century, I have been told time and time again that public space is the realm of encounter. What's more, I have a particular interest in case studies that were designed with the specific purpose of stimulating encounters. And noteworthy in this respect, I think, are the Mark II new towns in Britain, which can be considered real-life experiments in enhancing encounters to shape a new society. And I would argue that some of the issues that were addressed in the development of these Mark II new towns remain relevant today, not only in light of the current pandemic, which has resulted in ample speculation about how the shape of our cities might change forever, but also in light of contemporary calls for social justice, which have revealed deep segregations in our society. And such societal schisms, I believe, would only worsen if some of the measures proposed in articles such as this one become common practice, because social distancing is certainly not a cure for social segregation. Now, to get to the story of Britain's new towns, the history is probably known to many of you, or at least in part. By the mid-1950s, a mere decade after the 1946 New Towns Act had been passed, and as the first generation of new towns was opening, the initial euphoria that had been generated by this New Towns program had worn off. In an article published in the Architectural Review in 1953, Gordon Cullen castigated the new towns for their prairie planning, arguing that the combination of low densities and extravagant engineering standards for road widths and sidelines had produced soulless towns characterized by vast areas of leftover public space. He wrote, "One of the essential qualities of a town is that it is a gathering together of people and utilities for the generation of civic warmth. However overcrowded, dingy, insanitary, and airless the old towns may be, most of them retain this quality, which is the essential quality without which a town is no town, with which lack of air is merely a minor nuisance. Let us call it towniness. Where has it got to in the new towns? Or are the new towns merely intended to negative the old towns and so negative towniness? We see no sign of it there. Instead, we see the growth of a new ideal at work, which might be described as ebbiness, the ebb tide, the cult of isolationism." Now, in this article, Cullen called for densities to be raised and for new towns to recreate some of the towniness of traditional ones, as he equated density with a sense of civic warmth. And accordingly, the creation of civic warmth and a sense of community became key concerns for those charged with designing the next generation of British new towns, the so-called Mark II new towns, such as those of Runcorn, and you see the plan here, and also Irvine. And much hope was vested in the role that their town centers would play in doing so. With a central location and offering a rich mix of functions, these town centers were designed to recapture the towniness that Cullen had declared lost in first-generation new town designs. But the urban forms that their architects opted for were a far cry, not only from the first generation new towns, but also from traditional town centers. They sought to create a novel towniness and a sense of civic warmth through a new kind of urbanity. And the first Mark II new town to be realized in the UK, as you all know, was Cumbernauld. Located 12 miles northeast of Glasgow, Cumbernauld was designated a new town in 1955. And in response to the critique leveled against the first generation of British new towns, the initial plans that were submitted for Cumbernauld set the housing density deliberately high at 65 dwellings per hectare. But its greatest innovation was to create the town center as one vast multi-deck, multifunctional megastructure that would be alive 24/7. Designed by Geoffrey Copcott, who spearheaded the Central Area Group, Cumbernauld Town Centre soon became the darling of the architectural press. Upon completion of its first phase, the Architect's Journal declared the structure an example of 20th century plastic dualism, where Kasbah and Bazaar have been combined in one single statement of a town. And from this description, it appears that Copcott's design responded successfully to Cullen's plea for greater towniness. The formula to his town's success was to place within one single structure all the major social, commercial, and shopping functions of the town, and to make it more flexible than existing new town centers. And the plan on top here shows this sort of phased expansion in a linear manner. So the green bit is the first phase, the dark gray bit is the second phase, and then these light gray areas are the future phases. And what I always find amazing about this drawing is that this section here is actually a cross section taken here, so it's not a long section. Now, this latter strategy, the flexibility, so planning it in phases, was devised to allay another criticism that emerged in the 1960s, which held that modern urban planning, and textbook example of this were the first generation British new towns, was insufficiently capable of responding to future growth and change. It was suggested that urban planning needed to take greater account of uncertainty and indeterminacy of the future. And given our current circumstances, it should perhaps come as no surprise that this need to plan for indeterminacy and flexibility is something that is today again on the table. Now, in the 1960s, as indeterminacy, but also urban density emerged as buzzwords, Cumbernauld became a beacon for subsequent British new town centre development, particularly for the new towns of Runcorn and Irvine, which both had comparable multifunctional megastructures at their core. Located 16 miles west of Liverpool, Runcorn was formally designated a new town in 1964, and as in Cumbernauld, the design of its town centre, which was led by architect David Gosling, sought to combine the bulk of the town's communal functions in one multifunctional, multi-deck megastructure that, in the case of Runcorn, relied on an isotropic, expandable 108-foot supergrid. Hovering over parts of the town centre was this linear system of housing units, which were accessed through so-called service towers placed on the nodes of the supergrid, and you see these service towers here. This system of linear housing units was to extend beyond the town centre towards the south and also towards the west, where they were to anchor the megastructure into soon-to-be-developed housing areas. And at the heart of the town centre, and that's the bit that you see here, was a shopping center, which was raised 20 feet above ground to provide for ground floor servicing, and which connected through a system of pedestrian bridges to a civic zone to the north, an educational area to the east, and an entertainment hub to the south that included a museum, dance hall, youth center, cinema, theater, and sports facilities. Now, with sky bridges, a multimodal transportation system, and a rich mix of functions that promised unabated activity, Runcorn's town centre was a wet dream for cyberneticists, modern architects, and post-war planners alike. Its density and multifunctionality promised to deliver the sense of towniness that Cullen so craved, while the extendable and fillable supergrid responded to contemporary pleas to design for indeterminacy. But the supergrid of service towers concept was abandoned as soon as the construction of the first phase of the complex, and this was the shopping center shown here, was completed. Grosvenor House, an office block that was constructed to the north, and the Department of Employment offices to the east, which started construction shortly after completion of the shopping center, already abandoned this supergrid concept. Not surprisingly, all other town center components that were constructed subsequently also relinquished the supergrid concept, including James Sterling's ill-fated Southgate housing estate that was built to the south of the shopping center during the 1970s. Many years later then, a cinema opened to the immediate south of the shopping center. And while this shed-like structure that you see here was of course at a significant remove from this much more imaginative proposal that Gosling had drawn up in 1966, and this was his cinema complex here, it did represent the first piece of this recreational cluster that was part of the original design. Unfortunately, the cinema also remained the only piece to be realized, as the other components, such as a museum, youth center, theater, and sports facilities, never eventuated. Now, very briefly, the second example, a very similar story unfolded in Irvine. Bordering the Firth of Clyde, 23 miles southwest of Glasgow, Irvine was designated a new town in 1966, and it was to be built on top of the old burgh of Irvine, which was split into by the Irvine River, which you see here, and it had a commercial center on the east bank and then a railway station along with rundown housing and sort of decaying harbor area on the west bank. Now, the master plan that was developed for the new town in January 1971 proposed to create a road bypass, and you see the road bypass here around the town of Irvine that would divert through traffic away from the old town center and then open up possibilities to rethink the old Irvine Bridge. And the old Irvine Bridge historically connected the two parts of the town. Now, the new master plan proposed to replace the old Irvine Bridge with an enclosed shopping mall that would span across the Irvine River. This shopping mall was to be built in 3 phases. So the first phase, shown here, spanned the Irvine River, and other than retail also contained offices, a cinema, and a hotel here. And the second phase comprised an extension of the main shopping complex on the west bank, as well as an office tower, shown here. And then the third phase here was to extend the shopping center to the existing railway station here. Now, itself no small feat. This shopping center was but one fragment of a larger megastructure that, like the town center of Cumbernauld, relied on a linear system of growth. It also combined a set of different functions, including civic, commercial, residential, and recreational functions in a novel and dense urban form. So this sort of serpentine megastructure was to widen and narrow as it traversed the whole town and then connect the old burg of Irvine in the east, so shown here, with a modern and new recreation center to be built in the west along the harbor and foreshore by means of a narrow high-density strip of upper level harborside housing, and that's the strip here. But once the first phase of the shopping center was completed, and here you see another image of this first phase, so basically this was a new shopping bridge across the river, construction of the second phase took some time to materialize, and when it did, the original megastructure concept had been abandoned. Instead, several shed-like additions were built that, while listlessly attempting to connect to the existing circulation system, made few concessions to follow the original design. And as a result, phase 3, which was to be built here, which would have connected the shopping center to the railway station, was never built. Now, with this key connection missing, and with this housing strip that was to create an elevated pathway from the railway station to the new recreation center by the harbor already abandoned, the new recreational center that was built by the harbor lay disconnected from the rest of the town, and this recreational center has recently been demolished and replaced by a new leisure center adjoining the town hall, so in the heart of the old burg. Now, to say something about lived experience. I visited all these new towns some time ago, back in the day when we could still do field work as opposed to homework. I traveled to Cumbernauld in April 2017, and I stayed in Runcorn and Irvine during my Christmas holidays that same year. And I found that the aborted urban dreams of Runcorn and Irvine, like that of their predecessor, Cumbernauld, leave what can only be described as bleak remains. I'm sorry, Catherine. Poundland, Pound World, and other low-range commercial chains have taken up residence in the shopping components of these town center complexes, and the other civic and recreational urban functions that were part of the original design have long since moved elsewhere. Contemporary impressions of these new town centers paint a very different picture from the sketches that their design teams prepared in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, these drawings express the belief that these megastructural forms would create a sense of civic warmth. They present consciously designed environments featuring a social mix of mod shoppers enjoying a consumer dream world. Consumption, leisure, play, and even a hint of the Bordian dérivé are prominently present. And it was this discrepancy that I observed between these optimistic sketches from the 1960s and 1970s and my own lived experience, a sort of lackluster and lifelessness, that led me to question what had gone wrong in the first place. So in this history of Runcorn and Irvine's town centers, of which I am now a small part as a result of my writing, I adopted the role of the pathologist, the person who conducts a post-mortem to determine the cause of death. My diagnosis points to the flexibility and deliberate indeterminacy of the schemes, which was always based on the assumption that these structures would grow. But such growth never happened, or if it did not happen as it had been planned. And as a result, most centers of second wave British new towns are manifestly incomplete. Now, to conclude, the question could be posed what the shape of our town centers might look like if we try and imagine a response to the current crisis that we're facing. In response to the pandemic, indeterminacy and flexibility are once again buzzwords, but density, towniness, and civic warmth are not high on the agenda. Instead, social distancing reigns supreme. Now, urban design is always a product of its time, and my only hope is that if the cities as we know them today are indeed to change forever, that the current health crisis does not overshadow or will not overshadow other crises that we're facing, not in the least the environmental and the social crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Janina, for your thought-provoking presentation. I know the audience will have lots of questions for you, but I'll let Beatrice to take the lead. Beatrice, would you like to speak?
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I thought it was fascinating. And I think your work around shopping in general is really interesting, and especially now because we see what happens when shopping kind of disappears from a city. And so I wonder it's kind of a general question. I hope it's not too existential, but like what makes towniness? So what is the relation between commerce and shopping and public space? Do you think when shopping leaves a city, does this space become more or less public because it's less dense, I would say, because less people come to city centers to shop, or these superstructures that you showed? But at the same time, maybe there's more freedom to do other things, precisely because these functions leave. Thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. So yeah, I'm interested in your point of view or your thoughts on that.
Thanks for the question, Beatrice. Well, I think it's a it's a difficult question to respond in a way. Well, as I told you when we were chatting before, I live in Antwerp and I live right next to the high street. And when I go outside now, I mean, the shops are closed, there's a lockdown, there is no one there. So I do think that often in our discipline, we tend to see commerce and private development as a sort of monster, something to keep at bay because it disturbs other more civic functions. But what I've learned from looking at these town centers is that you actually need the commerce, but you need the commerce as well as the civic functions, as well as other spaces. You need the mix for public space to function as it should. When people sort of pose the question like what happens when shopping leaves, I think you cannot go without it. I mean, commerce has been something that we've been living with. We just cannot live without it. But you need that healthy mix, I would say. And you also need a good connection to other civic functions. And that's also what was lacking in these town centers. They were often a bit too disconnected from other civic functions in the way they were developed. I hope that responds to your question.
Yeah, thank you.
So does anyone has any other questions? You can raise your hands. Or we can have questions from YouTube also. So I might ask one question for you, but my question is more about your methodology. And I'm asking this question because I am an architectural history student who had to complete her dissertation during lockdown. So as far as I can see from your presentation, there's a great deal of archival work, and you said that you have been in these places personally. So what methodologies do you think were crucial to your research, and would you be able to use them if you had to stay at home?
I think that's an excellent question. Thanks so much. Because it also allows me to provide a bit of context. While I was doing this research, I was living in Australia. So I had to do quite a bit of remote research because I could not actually physically go there. And then the only free time I had was my Christmas holidays. And my partner didn't really appreciate me saying, let's go to the new towns and spend our Christmas holidays there. But I think it was absolutely essential that I did, because I think it's only through visiting these places, and I think maybe visiting them over Christmas when everything is supposed to be cheery made the dreariness all the more palpable to me. And I think it's also that helped me formulate my research questions. So I think I'm very much in line with what Catherine was saying before. You need to visit these places to understand these places. And I think it was through the visiting and then the desktop research that I'd been doing, looking at all these glamorous drawings, like these ambitious drawings, and then you arrive there and you think, my goodness, where am I? So I think it was absolutely essential, and I hope that's not discouraging for you, because I know that it's quite difficult for you at the moment to do that. But yeah, I do think it is absolutely essential to also go there. I mean, archival research, sometimes you can find a way around it. They can scan things and send things, but the visiting of the places, I think it's absolutely essential to see what's happened.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I can see that Mary has a question. Mary, you can open your camera. Yeah.
Hi, Gina. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. Gina, what about the political side, the sort of relationship to welfarist policies, etc.? Because essentially these towns were built on some notion of redistribution of wealth, and which didn't last that long, and now they're just desperately poor places, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, very much so. I mean, this presentation that I've given now is part of a longer paper that also looks at sort of the political context, because also part of the reason why these town centers failed, and also part of the reason why they were developed to be a phased development, is because the first step was attract investment, and the investment was often a developer that would come and build the shopping center, which was built first, and then they couldn't get all the money together to build all the other components. So because of course it was a period in which Britain was not so wealthy, in which there was a crisis happening, but they were sort of aiming for the dream. Yeah, so that context is of course very important and very central to this story as well, to get the complete picture of what happened. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, Murray, but yeah.
Yeah, Paul also raised his hand. Paul, yeah.
Thank you very much. Sorry to have a second go. I really enjoyed the talk. Oddly enough, we pre-recorded the talk with Karen Burns, which is going to be broadcast tomorrow, and she made the comment that architects are always keen on techno-utopianism. I suppose it's not it's a criticism that could be made of this idea that you can build towniness through megastructures. Do you have a sort of comment on that in the context of the places you've looked at?
Yes, well, I think that's a good observation, and I was very happy to see that Karen is also part of the lineup, because she's of course also a great speaker. My comment on that would be, I hope that we're past that now. So to be quite frank, I hope that we've noticed that this sort of techno-utopianism maybe is not the way to go. But if I read all the contemporary newspaper reports written about how our cities are going to change in light of the pandemic, in Dutch we have a saying, I hold my heart, because I might have a heart attack, but I think this is maybe not the way to go.
So Peg wants to come in.
Mina, thank you. We've actually got a message, a question that's come from someone who's watching through YouTube. So I'll just read it out and Janina can respond. Someone called Lily, who says, does dependency on investment from large retailers of these structures come at the expense of local independent stores?
Well, that's also an excellent question. In most cases, they did try to, because there was, of course, resistance, because many of these new towns were built in places where there were already town centers and where there were already shops established. So, and those people often reacted against this new development coming in. So there were mechanisms set in place to make sure that the little shopkeepers that were there would also find a place. But of course, there was a lot of competition to also attract, I assume it's a Marks and Spencer's in Britain, to attract the big shops that would bring in the people that would then also be able to walk past the little shops. So this is a very good question. There was always this tension between the small local shopkeepers. Many of them had already had a shop in the town center. And then this new shopping structure trying to attract also major investment as well as the little shop owners, or convince them at least that it would be good for their business as well, which more often than not was not the case.
I think we can have one final question from Eva.
Yes, thank you, Janina, for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering, about sort of in the end, you're sort of saying that these shopping centers are now things like Poundland, and sort of indicated that you found them slightly perhaps depressing. I don't think you really said this kind of word, but I've been to a lot of, I worked for the 20th Century Society for 10 years and in Heritage generally for 14 years. Also looking at cinema buildings that have been turned into bingo halls. And a lot of these spaces, you could say, are not functioning the way they were intended and perhaps are slightly depressing or something. But they do actually still perform quite important social spaces for more marginalized groups. And I've been wondering if you've had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it. Oh, sorry, I hear an echo. I think that's a very good question because, yeah, of course, this is my outsider perspective, and of course, spending time there, and I spent a few weeks in both of them. You do see that people go there, and these are important meeting places for the community. And I also spoke to people there, and they really say they love it. So, at the same time, I know I'm very critical about it, but some parts of them don't work, but some parts of them work very well, I would say. So maybe my judgment was a bit too harsh and too much across the board, because they do perform a very important function. And many people actually say they really like their town center.
Yes, I mean, I think they just sort of function perhaps differently. And then it's perhaps important to start looking at how they function differently and for which groups, and how to perhaps make that a sustainable option for them and as a reinterpretation. Yeah. I mean, Elephant and Castle is also ready to go. Perhaps it's already gone, and it was an important market for migrant groups, and so they really liked this area, and they were able to afford the cheaper rents as well, and so where will they go? Or in the bingo, in the cinemas, these beautiful historic Art Deco cinemas that are now bingo halls for old ladies. Well, where will the little old ladies go? Yeah. There's no more bingo hall. So I think in terms of sort of architecture has this amazing ability to be reappropriated and to change and to become a different ground for different groups. And I think it's really important to sort of look at actually the inhabitation of these spaces as well, and think about that perhaps although it's not shiny middle-class white people in them, that these spaces are very important.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And perhaps I should add sort of like a note to my lecture, because also in relation to what Mina said before, this is maybe also not the way in which I prefer to do research, because I was fascinated by these town center structures. But as I said, I was in Australia. So the research had to be very condensed, and my experience was only based on my own experience. But what I always prefer to do in research is also precisely engage with the community and find out, how does this work? And this is something that I was not able to do in this research because of circumstances. So I think it's very good that you point that out, because I want to make clear that I am certainly not launching a plea to demolish any of these structures, because I do think they are valuable structures, and I do think they tell us a bit about the heritage and the ambition that were embedded. But I do think they need to be rethought from a contemporary perspective, on how they could be used better in the future. So you're absolutely right, Eva. Thanks for that.
Sorry, I think our time is up now, so I'm afraid we need to move on. So thank you, Janina, for your excellent remarks and being here with us today, and to the audience, thank you for your intriguing questions. Now I'll pass the mic to Drew for introducing our next speaker. So over to you, Drew.
Yeah. Thank you, May. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. Dr. Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui is Assistant Professor at Barnard College, Columbia University. She is writing 2 book manuscripts: Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camps and Humanitarian Settlement, on the history, visual rhetoric, and spatial politics of the Dadaab refugee camps, and Minette de Silva and a Modern Architecture of the Past, on wartime heritage politics in Sri Lanka, understood through the intellectual career of one of the first women architects. I welcome you, Anuradha, and I'll pass on the mic to you now. You can share your screen. Thank you.
I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, after 8 months, I still forget to unmute. Thank you so much. It's really, really an honor to speak with you all, particularly in this pretty pregnant moment that we are in over here. I'm a little bit familiar with the intellectual ecosystem at the Bartlett, and I really know it as one in which the depth and precision of discourse is developed through asking questions and re-asking questions. And so it means a lot to me to be here with you. I was really taken with the conceptualization of homework and your articulation of the problem of lived experiences as a basis for architectural histories. And some of you shared your work on the inhabitations of janitors and the invisibility of these custodial caretakers of society, the problem of reading Cairo through texts and through materiality, the queer life of a landmark cinema, and also comfort writ large as a focal point for domesticity and ritual. I think these physical histories and material sensibilities, which I believe is the theme that we are dealing with today, have at their core forms of meaning that you've begun elucidating through a kind of dialogical relationship with these objects. So in that vein, I wanted to talk to you today about a praxis and a pedagogy that I'm currently engaged in that hinges on the transformation of lived experiences into something that we might begin to call architectural histories. And to do that, I want to first credit the work of a group of students who are in a course that I'm teaching called Colonial Practices, and their intellectual labor on the construction of the research and the public scholarship that I'm going to be discussing with you today. I think that some of them are in the audience, and I'd like to name them by name, if I may. Kojo Abudu, Maya Bikel, Aisha Bostani, Gabriel Garon, Joseph Gideon, Mai Morsi, Samuel Needleman, Nur Jabarin, Amber Officer Narvasa, Dora O'Neill, Mahum Kazi, Javeria Shahid, Christopher Tuktuk, Noah Weiss, and Athena Wyatt. And I'm bringing them up particularly with the aim of tying them to you and building solidarities between the work you all undertake. I also raise our collaborative process in this course by way of telescoping to your articulation of lived experiences and how we use lived experiences to think about the way we write architectural histories. Before I talk about the aspect of this course that I want to bring before you, I'll just explain the orientation of the course and the syllabus. It draws from a concept of coloniality, and I use a framing by Nelson Maldonado Torres to open up the syllabus that says that coloniality is different from colonialism. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. And coloniality instead refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism and define our lives in different ways. And he names many ways. He says it's maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our experience. And I raise this as the way the course begins by way of saying that it's a seminar that is really intended to question colonial practices through architectures, institutions, infrastructures, and territories around the world. And we really visit many territories around the world. And in that sense, we're not doing a specific histories in that sense. We're really trying to theorize these forms of coloniality that, as Maldonado Torres writes, survive colonialism. And some of what we are doing each week is to study specific aesthetic and spatial practices histories of construction, destruction, maintenance, and use of architecture, but also to map these alongside readings in Black and Brown consciousness, feminist theory, indigenous and anti-colonial and decolonial theory. And I'm asking students to really think about the places around which maps have been constructed, these spaces across which nomads and migrants have moved, and within which insurgents have configured to really form the intellectual problems of the course, and also the strategic positions from which to write and think with architecture. So one of the things we do, students work on an individual research project, and we also build a collective study. And for that collective study, the course stages a series of public dialogues. In the day of Zoom, we are staging these virtually, and they're being webcast and also digitally archived. The series is called Building Solidarities, Racial Justice in the Built Environment. It's intended to produce rigorous links between theory and praxis. And so I'd like to share with you the poster for the series, which I hope you can all see. And I'll just explain a little bit about the series and its conception. Building Solidarities as an umbrella for the series, and this is a series that may continue into the future as other students pick it up and make decisions about how to grow it, is intended as a form of mutual pedagogy between the Barnard Columbia campus and the public on constructed environments, urban life, and ecologies. This dialogue series, which is subtitled Racial Justice in the Built Environment, foregrounds communities of Minneapolis, Nairobi, and New York in order to process the conditions around the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath in cities whose racial histories have long impacted the built environment and provoked recent sympathy protest. Our dialogues, as I mentioned, are guided by the students in my course, Colonial Practices, and they involve guests whose work and whose lives have been deeply enmeshed in the central problems that the course focuses on. In that sense, these guests are, in a sense, bearers of lived histories. And through our dialogues with them, I'm really trying to think through what it means to think with someone while in direct confrontation with them, and also what that means as something that is transformed or translated into architectural histories. So you can see on the poster these various dialogues. The dialogues center around the built environment, and they center around racial justice, and we wanted to very specifically invite guests who knew these three cities or had a connection to these three places so that our conversations could be specific. And they are guests whose work in some ways straddle academia and non-academia. So we started by looking at institutions, institutional inhabitations, with guests from the Go Down Arts Center in Nairobi and Navatman in New York, two performing arts organizations. We had a very beautiful conversation with four African-American and South Asian women on the very sad evening where the Breonna Taylor verdict was released. The next conversation was called Building Historical Consciousness with architect Chris Cornelius, Elsa Hoover, who's also studying, I guess, to become a professional architect, and Nick Estes, a historian, all three here in the United States, and all three citizens or members of various Native American nations. The third dialogue, which we will have next week, is called Monumental Landscapes, and we'll have Kate Bean, who is an Indigenous historian from Minneapolis, Lydia Muthuma, who's a historian and art historian from Nairobi, and Bhakti Sringarpure, who also runs the, she's a professor and also runs the website Warscapes. And the fourth dialogue is called Environmental Reclamations. We'll be speaking with Alishine Osman, who I met as a former refugee from the Dadaab refugee camps. Anisa Salat, who is working in various ways on environmental reclamations in Mogadishu, and Huma Gupta, who is running the podcast series for Jadalia. So through these discussions that we have with these guests, we're doing kind of recorded dialogues, each one with 3 guests and the students. We do research into their work and we build appropriate questions. We put them on the table for the dialogue. It's recorded, and these will eventually be podcast with these different groups: the Go Down Arts Center and Navatman, the Red Nation, Warscapes, and Jadalia on the environment page in the status podcast. So it really is an idea about taking research and putting it into the public sphere and bringing a kind of public form of scholarship into perpetuity, in a sense, by archiving these. So our aim in these dialogues, beyond that kind of scholarship, is to build mutual solidarities between our campus and our partners. We really see us all together as experts and as students, and we are trying to use our platform to be as hospitable as possible and extend the political imaginaries and the community futures and the solidarities that our partners could potentially build with each other. We are specifically studying racial and environmental complexities and injustices. And in doing so, my goal was to remain vigilantly reflexive about the relationship between this campus and our neighbors in Harlem and elsewhere. Columbia and Barnard famously have a fraught relationship with their neighbors. And I suppose one of the inspirations for this practice, for this form of pedagogy, and maybe I'll stop sharing. One of the inspirations for this was that as members of a university community, it was important to me to heed a warning by Linda Tuiwai Smith, who wrote that belief in the ideal that benefiting mankind is indeed a primary outcome of scientific research is as much a reflection of ideology as it is of academic training. It becomes so taken for granted that many researchers simply assume that they as individuals embody this ideal and are natural representatives of it when they work with other communities. So in working with our partners, we take up her challenge to, quote, question the assumed nature of those ideals and the practices they generate. And my own goal in that is also to make a wish for peace. We do this much as you have all done today in a kind of webinar format. It's not intended to produce a kind of hard division between us at the virtual seminar table and our audience members, but it does serve the function of protecting the students somewhat and protecting the intimacy of the seminar room, while also being able to share our learning experiences as widely as possible. We share it with a wider invited public, and then it's podcast to a general public. Some of what I would like to talk with you about today are the kind of ethics of sharing research and how we all stand on that, and particularly how you stand at the beginning of your scholarly interventions. So to maintain the intimacy of the seminar, only the students and our guests appear on the screen, and the audience kind of participates using this Q&A function of Zoom. So some of what I think we could also talk about today is that business of mediation how a classroom is made through virtual and digital means, and what the materiality of that is actually. I typically invite the participants on the screen to really reference any questions that come in if they can. And also, I ask all participants, the guests, the audience, the students, to be generous. I think we are all utterly nervous with this new medium that we're all in. We are very exposed in ways that we haven't been before. So again, in the spirit of treating all as experts and all as students, I really invite participants to work together to co-create a space and to build solidarities. So I do this in honor of the communities, lives, and futures that are affected while we study. And I name some of these people at the beginning of each of these events. I would like to name them now. The essential workers who make it possible for us to conduct work, the Lenape elders, relatives, and children whose land our campus occupies and who have been stewards of this land, and the displaced peoples and citizens of many indigenous nations for whom New York has been home. All Black people, especially those whose enslavement is written into the wealth of this institution, and the past and present Harlem neighbors to whose labor and disenfranchisement our campus owes a debt. Migrants from all over the world whose dispossession and sacrifices have ensured the prosperity of this institution, especially those impacted by United States imperial interests who arrive here to participate in its economy or flee homes targeted by its military, and those we have lost in a pandemic due to colonial practices that we have allowed to persist, and those who remain at risk due to inhumane economies, carceral and security states, and racist, casteist, and misogynistic policies that we must actively refuse. I put these political questions on the table in this seminar, in this symposium, that I feel is effectively about scholarship, because I think increasingly we are all called upon to really think about how our scholarship and our politics are intertwined. I don't think there's any one of us who runs away from that anymore, or who even wants to. So I think I want to conclude by putting a set of questions to you that I believe have come out of these public dialogues that we have initiated, because I believe they may be relevant to this symposium and the questions you've initiated. Number one, how do we speak to each other? Which I think Yanai Nagase has spoken to us about very nicely. How do forms of generosity and care in this speech inform the narratives we produce? How do we build histories through dialogue? How do we live on the border between the university and the world? How do we effect architectural history through the lived experience of confrontation? And we've been dealing with many confrontations in this dialogue series, between a reader and the author of a text, between a human and a screen, between the evacuated time and space of virtual connection and the dense time and space of the real political world. How do we process social and civil trauma through scholarship? What is the purpose of scholarship? How may scholarship build a theory of togetherness, build solidarities? So I'm eager to raise these questions in a context in which you're also experimenting with what it means to initiate a discussion in a setting in which constraints and freedoms are being held closely together and inform our lived experience, demanding that we understand what lived experience means for our histories. So I thank you very much and welcome your questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Anuradha, for the wonderful talk. I especially admire the position that you've taken for your seminar as well, about the dialogical relationship that you've had with the public, and also about the idea of collective learning, which transgresses these boundaries of like scholarly discourses as well. I have a couple of questions, but I'd like if somebody else comes in first. So I would like to hand over to Maria, and then we can take questions from others.
Sure, thank you so much. And to Dhruv as well for following up on such a rich and fascinating talk. I was writing down so many questions as you were talking. I think I can probably speak on behalf of everyone on this call in saying that building solidarity sounds like such an interesting, really critical program. And in particular, your kind of approach to devising that program is, yeah, I'm very much going to kind of think about your the way in which you think about agency and ethics and centering the lived experiences of others very much in my own work. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that I think it's really incredible that you're kind of naming your collaborators, whether they're direct or indirect collaborators, and that's such a lesson. I think so much agency is lost to how knowledge is produced within the university institution. So that was really inspiring. I have two questions, if that's allowed, around kind of public forms of scholarship. You touched on ethics and notions of generosity and empathy. I think firstly, how have you found the public? I know you have kind of 2 programs left and you've done a couple already, but how have you found the public have been engaging in your discussions and in your program? And second to that, and it's kind of a selfish question because I'd love to engage in the program somehow, but what will the legacy of it be in terms of kind of archiving? Will you archive the programs?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we started the semester with the idea that we would invite selected guests to be in the room essentially, or be with us as we met with these different guests and had these conversations. And we effectively, the way our semester is set up, we have 2 reading sessions and then one of these public dialogues. So we effectively have 2 seminar sessions in the first one, we read readings broadly on the theme. In the second one, we really directly read the works of the people we're about to talk to. And then we formulate a set of questions and then we meet with them. So it's a little hectic. Our semester was cut short because of the way the university reorganized the semester system to deal with the pandemic. So we don't have as much breathing room as I would like, but it has forced us into, I want to say, a kind of mode of intellectual production that's very focused. So we spend time especially in that session just before one of the public dialogues, really honing in on what will be the guiding questions, because one of the things we do with each of the sessions is issue a research guide to the public. So with that, we share a set of questions with our guests, allow them some time to give us some feedback on, whether they have any issues with the questions. And then we make a bibliography that will be issued to the public, and we produce a PDF of a research guide that has our guiding questions, has our bibliography, and it has all the readings. And we issue that to the wide public of everyone who has registered to attend these events. And you're all welcome to attend. It'd be a little bit late at night for you, but you can do it. Some of the feedback I've gotten from the students is that, of course, the events themselves, the audience members really are effectively our colleagues. They're other academics, they're students, they're professors. I think there's also people from a wider public coming in whose names we don't recognize, but they're not gigantic events. There's maybe, I think there have been about 60 or 70 people attending each. Maybe that's gigantic. I don't actually have any clue how big is big anymore. But the way, some of the students gave some feedback that, this is in a way just an echo chamber. But I suppose I'm still hanging on to, we're in the middle of a process, and we are still releasing the recordings of these events to the organizations. One of the guests from in each of the dialogues is also, the head of an organization that does some sort of media. So the Red Nation, Bhakti runs this website, Warscapes. Huma has been doing this work for the environment page for Jadalia. So we are effectively building podcasts that will be issued as part of the content of these different websites. So they will be archived publicly. They are just not necessarily happening in real time. I think that because we have to get a lot of permissions, et cetera, and because I have literally no experience in production of this sort, I'm also learning as we go. But the idea is that we take those materials and we issue them to the guests. What we have also been issuing to our guests, again, as a form of mutual pedagogy, are things like the data reports that come in, like who is actually visiting the different events. We issue all of our research, we have a note taker who takes notes in both of the sessions in preparation for the events. We issue our class notes to our guests in case they should want to read them. The idea really is to build a conversation that isn't unidirectional. And our hope too is that the people who we are trying to bring together are interlinking with one another. We're bringing together two performing arts organizations that wouldn't necessarily have a chance to meet each other except in this kind of a context. And yet their work very much overlaps, but they're just on opposite sides of the world. We're, bringing together three indigenous thinkers and practitioners who didn't necessarily meet each other before. So these are things that I think are important. In my mind is always the question of like, well, is this just another lecture series? Because since everyone has decided that now that we're all on Zoom, we can all just have lecture series every minute of our lives. But I think that I retain this kernel of hope that through the collaborative process with the students, and it's really the students who are, I maybe curated the guests, but I think the students are honestly reading the work of the guests and putting it to the test. I do think that we are doing something that my hope is that we are kind of building a kind of critical community. And, not that any of us want to descend into a discussion of this current election, but one thing I will say is that building critical community, in my mind, is the number one thing that those of us in academia should be doing right now. We have a certain kind of a platform, and we should be building community with it, and not the kinds of communities that people are talking about on the news, but this kind of community.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you so much. Just before I hand back over to Dhruv, I just wanted to say that I think so much of our kind of, I don't know, what we're hearing about the current conditions, I'm thinking about the way that we've positioned this evening, even as what's afforded and lost to us online. And we focus on the part that's lost. Actually, we don't really focus on the part that's afforded. It's not an ideal scenario, but I think your program is really testament to the fact that without this kind of transition to online discussion, the fact that you're able to kind of connect these really critical communities with one another is a really brilliant thing that's kind of come out of the pandemic, even if so much of it is terrible. Dhruv, did you want to, you mentioned you had questions.
Thank you, Maria, for the wonderful question and the comment. Before I ask my question, I would just like to ask if there's a question on the YouTube page if somebody wants to ask. Okay, so I'll just quickly ask a question. It might be a little digressing away from the topic, but there were certain keywords that you that recurred, which was about migrants and which was also about racial justice, and like connecting that with our current seminar, which is about homework and something which is very strongly connected to the pandemic as well. What I wanted to understand was get a sort of reflection from you about this idea of how migrants, first of all, locate themselves in this idea of home already. And when we're talking about during the pandemic, how people are basically locked within their homes, but like in the global south, there are these daily wage workers who were stranded away from their homes and they experienced the pandemic in a very different manner. So I just wanted to understand if you had certain reflections on the idea of justice or in the idea of the notion of home during these times.
And Dhruv, I'm sorry, the sound cut out a little bit. Are you saying migrants? You're asking to reflect on migrants? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you know, the migration that happened in India this past year, you know, is a profound thing that we'll live with for a long time, that many people have compared it to partition. And I've just heard from my friends and colleagues of, you know, seeing from the windows of their apartments a sea of people walking up the highway to walk home. And I think these are things that we will have to live with, I think. I mean, I, you know, have been really also meditating on migration for a long time and what it means for migration to be one's primary inhabitation rather than an exceptional state. And I think that, you know, one of the ways in which to think about the idea of building solidarities in a moment like this is to really challenge concepts of home. I think home, the concept of home has been really hijacked by the security state, protectionist states, states that are very interested in the production of borders for their own sakes, the production of borders as a representative mechanism rather than as an actual negotiating space. So it really isn't about being friends with neighbors and creating a jointly lived space, but instead it's about representing something that can be monolithically called home. It's really not necessarily about mutual acknowledgement of lives lived together. So I think migrants only live with that acknowledgement. There is no other way for migrants. They must be, you know, acknowledging that at all times. So one of the major ways I've been thinking about migrants vis-a-vis architectural histories really is about archives and what it means to make an archive, what it means to be able to research an architectural history in an archive. Typically what you are researching in an official archive is a history of landed wealth. It's a history of fixity. It's a history of a purported stability, whether, you know, a nation state stability or an empire stability. For migrants, that kind of archive doesn't exist. A migrant is in a constant process of making that archive. So again, as I was thinking about your event today and this idea of material history, physical histories, I haven't fully theorized what we're doing in this class with making a podcast, and I don't work on digital anything. And there are many wonderful scholars, our colleagues who do, who could say a lot more about this. But I do think that some of what we are making is a kind of migrant archive. We're both making the research and then making the conversation and then capturing the conversation and then somehow disseminating the conversation into a field. And I think with all of that, let's call it scholarship, with all of that, there is a kind of an archive being created, but it's not a landed archive. And in that sense, I think it does cast toward a migrant life or a migrant imagination. I don't know if that fully gets at what you were asking, but I think it is in a way rather directly related to literally these people walking on foot to their homes across a continent. I think it's actually the same thing as people carrying the things they own on their backs. It's a way of encapsulating heritage so that it can be mobile and it can be carried. There's something to it that I think is very similar. But you're getting a sort of undercooked idea so far. I haven't fully thought this through, but I would love to hear what you all think of this, because it means a lot to me, this idea of heritage.
Yeah, I think we have one more question. If Polly would like to ask the question.
Did you say Polly?
Yeah.
Did you mean this Polly? Yeah.
If you had a question.
I think what's lovely about the conversations that we've had is trying to articulate how to kind of maybe imagine new ways of making archives. And this did come up in our previous talk yesterday with Karen Burns as well, where she put forward the seeking out of oral histories as a different approach to engaging with a different methodology to engage with site. And I thought that really related potentially really nicely with what you were saying, Janina, about wanting to go to your field trips, to go to visit the spaces, and then also looking at the visual documents. But what was missing out, or what you kind of added to that, was when you spoke with people, you found that they had stories which narrated positive aspects of their encounter. And I think that's what I'm really enjoying also, what you've just presented now, about this creating these solidarities, because it feels like there is a possibility of making choices about how we lay down the foundations for new archives. So that's my comment. It's not really a question as such. It's just a kind of a reflection on the wonderful opportunities that your module presents. Thanks.
Thank you, Polly. I'd like to thank our speaker again, and thank you all for being here. If you would like a final response, Anuradha, would be good.
No, just thank you all. Thank you for these reflections. I think that one of the things I've been meditating on a little bit is this what we think a university is for, and what we think archives are for, and how to take these things seriously or not. In the last dialogue, my friend Nick Estes, I think, put it quite beautifully. He said, I've worked in the fast food industry for as long as I've worked in academia. And I think that in some ways that needs to be the way that we start to understand what we're doing. I mean, he was speaking to many different things in that moment, but I think these are ways that I think we have to start really imagining what is lived experience and how does it inform our methodology. I think that it's not, I don't mean to just be anecdotal and say that you draw from your personal experience to read an archive, but I think that there is a kind of analytical power in an embodied experience that can inform the way that you read, whether it's an official archive or an archive that one has constructed, or a set of oral histories, or however you approach the objects that you want to study. I do think that that kind of embodied experience allows for a kind of knowledge that we need to start spending more time validating and raising our own expectations of ourselves. I also just want to say maybe this is my personal agenda, but I really do think we're so very privileged, and we just need to use our privilege ethically. We really, really must hold very close to us an agenda that has to do with who we are serving, with the knowledge that we gain, and what it is for, and how we can share it. I think that's becoming more and more evident to me as the kind of aims of something like architectural history. We just have to start thinking this way and living this way.
I absolutely agree with that sentiment. Thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to pass on to Adam to carry on with the session. Adam?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and the discussion was really, really great to hear as well. I'm just going to kind of start to wrap up, I think, but I'm going to say thank you so much to tonight's speakers. And I just want to know if any of you, Janina, Anurada, or Catherine, kind of have any final comments to make about anything that's been said today, or anything that you'd like to add, just before we start to wrap up tonight's conversations at all. Or if not, that's fine. Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much to Catherine, Janina, and Anurada tonight for being here and delivering some really, really interesting pieces, covering a really wide range of topics and issues and ideas. And it's been really interesting to see how you all responded to our kind of buzzword of homework in your own unique ways, whether you're referring to your study or COVID or anything like that. I'd also like to thank the organisational team behind tonight, which has been Paul, Bronte, Ken, Daniel, and our supervisor Peg, who's steered us through organising all of this over the last couple of months. And I'd also like to thank the audience for being here, the cohort, the lecturers from the Bartlett, and everyone watching on YouTube. And I hope you've all enjoyed our homework. And I will just pass over to Ken to make a final set of comments and announcements. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Well, before we end this night, I'm just going to talk about the publication. So let me share my screen. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the speakers for the fascinating lectures and all the members of the cohort and the academic staff for joining us this evening. As you may know, the symposium is part of a tradition that seeks to celebrate the work of the graduating cohort at the end of each academic year. Hence, each symposium is organized to showcase the resulting student research, intertwined with guest speakers, as it was today, in a chance to discuss and expand on the emerging methodologies, themes, and contexts that have been studied through the academic period. Now, evidently, the impacts of COVID-19 have shifted the manner in which we have conducted the current symposium, opting for an online format instead. Furthermore, during the organization of the symposium, we also pondered on how to approach the publication of the cohort's work. Normally, this live symposium would have been accompanied by a printed book. However, due to our current situation, we felt that it was imperative to restructure our dissemination practices towards the digital. Thus, recalling one of the major concerns raised by the cohort during these past months, we reflected in the way that we, as architectural historians, procure and obtain home information. When faced with the impossibility to visit archives, places, and buildings physically, our research inevitably leads us to the virtual realm. Here we find ourselves immersed in a world where information transits rapidly, especially so during the current pandemic, and it figures questions of archive and intellectual labor, as we have discussed today. Perhaps the more we are unable to live and remember the real world outside our homes, the more we resort on our computers to remember for us. Stamatis Zographos has written this as, an archive is thus the place where power is exercised. The archive decides what is for remembering, and this selection process automatically determines what is to be forgotten. Therefore, as the cohort worked through several online archives both here and internationally, We pondered on what was afforded to us on our current situation, and at the same time on what was lost and the forces that drove these archival operations. Hence, in an effort to continue to contribute to the deepening growth of online archives, and perhaps ironically, to contribute to forgetting the physical, we have created an online repository to store and showcase the work of this year's cohort and also the publications made on former symposiums. Concerned with creating a space reflective of current modes of living, whilst embracing a heightened opportunity to create a visual artifact, we hope this website evolves with the coming years as a centralized platform for the dissemination of the notable work produced by this program. So please visit bartlettarthistory.com on the 13th of November, and you will see the work produced by the cohort. And again, thank you very, very much for joining us this evening, and I hope to see you tomorrow.